So, about a week ago, I got a bug up my ass, and by that I mean I went through a phase of hypomania caused by insomnia, caused by my menstrual cycle, so you can actually blame this one on my period. And I decided to do a live stream talking about Hassan Piker's absolutely, inexcusably terrible Depth v. Heard coverage from 2022. My intention for the stream wasn't to vilify Hassan or anything, but to point out that while Hassan holds generally progressive positions most of the time, there is a problem with how he's handled women-centered topics in the past, and that's a problem that affects his ability to keep women, especially feminists, in his audience. As I've talked about ad nauseum, I think Hassan's constant battles against feminists represents a larger problem in the political discourse sphere, where leftist male commentators frequently failing to address patriarchy causes a lot of women to seek out other communities that will at least simulate actual feminist dialogue, like, for example, the gender critical movement, which adopts feminist rhetoric to promote anti-trans doctrine, ultimately leading women down an explicitly transphobic right-wing pipeline, which is bad. I think I've been pretty good at making sure that my audience knows that my feminism will never lead anyone down a path of turfism because I'm clearly not transphobic. It's not hard to use inclusive language or refer to trans people by their appropriate pronouns, which means it's very easy to signal to viewers that this is not a space for transphobes. There's some other pseudo-feminist discourse, though, that's a little bit harder to combat since the conversations around it aren't as integrated with, day-to-day conversations. It's easy to not realize how prevalent some talking points have become in some feminist spaces because it just doesn't come up as much as, the mere existence of trans and gender non-conforming people. And I think that I was kind of in denial about how common certain ideas were amongst younger feminists in particular, until I looked back at the comments and some of the chat messages from that last live stream where I was talking about Hassan, because I realized that a lot of you have some really troubling opinions about sex work. Here's an interesting comment that I received on that stream. I admit I skipped around a bit because I missed the initial stream. Is it addressed anywhere how the brothel Hassan went to wasn't raided for trafficking, it was raided for tax fraud, and that raid happened several years after his visit? Now, with absolutely no context, that comment looks absurd. My stream was about Hassan's Depth v. Heard coverage. At no point did I mention anything about a brothel or anything else related to Hassan's consumption of sex work because that's not a problem I've ever had with him. It wasn't a topic I even thought to broach, but clearly there's a lot of people in my community who feel differently, since a lot of the conversation in my comment section and my chat did wind up being about Hassan's patronage of a brothel and his support of decriminalized sex work. Comments like, "It sucks because his coverage regarding Gaza in the Middle East was generally good, but then I found out about his support of sex work and it was just an ick. I'm gonna stick to watching Bad Empanada from now on, LMAO." Or, "I needed this. I haven't watched yet, but I hope you shut him up on prostitution eventually too. That shit is pure female exploitation." Or, "Hassan is vile. I already didn't like him as he's so blasé about having gone to a brothel that got busted for trafficking." Now, that last one at least sounds reasonable. Whether you support decriminalized sex work or not, Hassan going to an establishment that got busted for trafficking would obviously be bad, and if he was blasé about that, that's even worse. The problem with that comment is, Hassan didn't go to a brothel that got busted for trafficking. At least, not really. I don't want to linger on this conversation for too long because I don't want to make this all about Hassan, even though it is good clickbait. But just so we're clear on the story here, in 2010, when he was 19 years old, Hassan Piker did go to a brothel in Germany called Artemis, and he paid to have sex with some of the workers there. It was completely legal. There have been absolutely no accusations brought by any alleged victims claiming that Hassan took part in anyone's trafficking. But 6 years after his patronage, the brothel was raided by about 900 police officers investigating claims of human trafficking and tax evasion. Now, first of all, the fact that that raid included 900 police officers should tell you something already. Even if there was evidence of trafficking, there's just no reality in which a 900 officer raid is an appropriate response, especially when there were less than 250 people in the building at the time. 900 police officers isn't a rescue mission, it's a PR stunt and an intimidation tactic. More important than that, though, the police didn't find sufficient evidence of trafficking, even with 900 officers on the case. It appears that the entire investigation was precipitated by the allegations of one woman who was being trafficked by her boyfriend turned pimp, and that woman's abuser was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison. It doesn't seem, however, that that man had any actual association with the club itself, nor does it seem like Artemis was the only location that her abuse took place in. Artemis was the site of an instance of trafficking. It wasn't the cause of the trafficking, and that's an important distinction to make, because if it were appropriate to prosecute every place that a crime has taken place in, the entire hospitality industry would crumble in turn. The brothel would have only been accountable to that woman's abuse if they had been knowingly complicit in it, and there just isn't really evidence that they were. Now, I don't want to fully let Artemis off the hook here. I don't have enough details to say that they're totally innocent. This is honestly just a very hard thing for me to research, considering that Artemis is a German establishment, which means that most of the news reports and court records surrounding this investigation are in German, which is a language I don't speak. It's possible that the owners and managers of Artemis could have done more to prevent that woman from being trafficked, and I'm certainly hesitant to say that they did nothing wrong, since ultimately, Artemis is a business raking in millions of dollars per year. Whenever money like that gets involved, morality tends to exit the conversation. I find it very hard to believe, though, that any of the people calling out Hassan for going to that brothel know a whole lot more than I do, since they never include any additional information or deeper sources when they're calling him out. They say things like, Hassan went to a brothel that got busted for trafficking. Google it. Despite the fact that when you Google it, you find out that all the trafficking accusations were dismissed. An investigation existing does not itself prove wrongdoing, especially when police have had a history of harassing and abusing sex workers, which a 900-officer raid into their workplace could very well be another example of. I think the worst you can say in terms of Hassan's participation here is that he hired the services of women who were potentially being trafficked and perhaps didn't take that potential seriously enough, which wouldn't be a shocking thing for a 19-year-old to do. But the fact is, trafficking can happen anywhere, at any business, in any industry. Forced and or coerced labor is not a problem specific to brothels or sex work. It's just a problem people seem to only really care about when they can relate it to some kind of sex work, because we as a culture are obsessed with sex and sex-based crimes. This is going to seem a little off topic, but while I'm calling out my own commenters here, there was something else I saw in the chat during that last stream that kind of bothered me. I don't remember the context, but somebody said, "This makes me think of Britney and how she had a mental health crisis, then conservatorship because of the trauma over being sexualized." Like, first of all, none of us can ever really know the cause or extent of Britney Spears' mental health crisis, for we are neither Britney Spears nor her doctors. But, as a longtime Britney expert, that is just such an unbelievably reductive way to portray her struggles when there were so many other very evident factors involved in the lead up to her conservatorship. She was in a very contentious and unfair custody battle. She had severe postpartum depression. She was being abused and possibly drugged by her quote-unquote manager. Her family was trying to perform religious conversions on her. Photos and videos of her made up roughly 20% of the entire paparazzi industry, etc., etc., etc. There were so many different things happening in Britney's life that saying she had trauma over being sexualized couldn't account for, to the point that I think portraying all of her struggles as coming from her sexualized image is just kind of dehumanizing. It puts an inappropriate amount of focus onto one thing about her public persona that you find uncomfortable, while ignoring all the other, frankly more impactful ways that she was being mistreated by the world around her. But people do this shit all the time, and I think it reflects the ways that we as a society treat sex like it's the ultimate corrupting force. Even more so than Britney, people do this with Amanda Bynes constantly. Like, the amount I see people trying to blame Dan Schneider for her breakdown while implying that he sexually abused her despite there being zero evidence of that is just absurd and upsetting. It's like people need a reason to hate Dan Schneider, and for some reason, all the credible evidence of him being a generally abusive boss toward children isn't good enough for them, so they have to invent additional scenarios that fit better into their own caricaturized idea of what a child predator looks like, while advocating for Amanda in the only way they know how to advocate for women, which is to paint her as a victim of severe sexual abuse in need of rescuing. I'm constantly seeing people say shit like, "Maybe we owe Jamie Spears an apology now that Britney is out of her conservatorship and uploading kind of weird stuff onto her Instagram sometimes," despite the fact that Jamie Spears is a fucking human trafficker. Throughout the 13 plus years of her conservatorship, there is ample evidence that Britney Spears was being forced and or coerced into labor she did not want to perform for the financial benefit of her team. The reason so many people don't see her as a trafficked woman, though, is that most people's concept of what a trafficked woman looks like revolves around ideas of sex and prostitution. It's easy for everyone to see the workers of Artemis as being potential victims of trafficking because they're sex workers. And it's easy to vilify Hassan Piker for purchasing those women's services when there was always a chance of those services being coerced by a third party Hassan didn't know about. But what about all the fans that bought tickets to see Britney from 2008 until her conservatorship ended? We all knew she was under a conservatorship overseen by her abusive father, and there were many, many signs of abuse taking place behind the scenes. There was always evidence that Britney didn't want to be doing all the things her management team was making her do. Because those things didn't involve having sex for money, though, way too many people are now comfortable rewriting the story of her conservatorship as something that was not that bad, which I don't think anyone would be doing if the details of her abuse happened to look just a little bit different. No one would be saying we owe Jamie Spears an apology if the stage he was forcing his daughter onto every night was at a strip club rather than the Axis Auditorium in the Planet Hollywood Resort and Casino. The war on sex work is not about protecting women from exploitation. It's about associating women's oppression with sex almost exclusively. The really frustrating line coming from the anti-sex crowd recently, specifically from the branches of this movement that like to think of themselves as feminists, is that they're pro-sex worker, but anti-sex work. Let's be really fucking clear about this. There is no such thing. Imagine if I said, I support women who get abortions, I just don't think they should be able to get them. Like, clearly that's a nonsense statement. There's a lot of support from this crowd for the end demand movement or the Nordic model of prostitution in which sex work is functionally illegal, but all criminal penalties fall onto the consumer, the person who purchases sex, while it remains fully legal to be a sex worker and sell your own services. Bubbling under pop singer Zara Larsson is actually an advocate for this. She did some Instagram stories a few years ago, and I just want to address some of her points here because a lot of what she says is just straight up wrong and essentially amounts to like feminist fear-mongering. Like when she says, research shows that sex trafficking is more prevalent in countries where buying sex is legal. Now, I don't know what specific research she's talking about, but if I had to guess, she's probably referencing the 2012 World Development article, Does Legalized Prostitution Increase Human Trafficking?, which has been cited by anti-sex activists a lot, most notably a group of celebrities who signed an open letter against Amnesty International in 2015 after Amnesty rightfully called for the decriminalization of sex work. The issue with the study all these celebrities are citing is that it's just bullshit. It looked at the rate of human trafficking both before and after the legalization of prostitution in Germany and concluded that an increase of trafficking overall was somehow related to that legalization, ignoring the fact that they weren't even narrowing their research down to just looking at the rate of sex trafficking specifically. They were looking at human trafficking rates as a whole when a vast majority of crimes that fit under the trafficking umbrella are completely unrelated to the sex trade. Because again, no one cares about human trafficking unless they can link it to sex. So to a lot of people, human trafficking and sex trafficking are interchangeable words, even though that's fucking ridiculous. Obviously, there are many other ways to traffic someone. What Zara is advocating for is a system in which sex workers technically aren't penalized for their work, but their work is still criminalized by the state to a degree that does compromise their access to resources that could keep them safe. A system in which getting caught buying sex work is punishable by law means the people selling sex can only do so under certain conditions that are necessarily based around secrecy and stigmatization. Let's go back to the abortion analogy for a second. Imagine if having an abortion was totally legal, but performing one wasn't. Okay, cool. Maybe you're not prosecuting women for having abortions, but you are making it so that women can no longer receive abortions in a normal doctor's office, meaning those women will have to find alternative routes that will likely put them into more danger. It's the same with sex work. While there is absolutely some shady shit going down in brothels sometimes, a brothel filled with people, including coworkers, is still a safer place for a sex worker to be than some random guy's car or apartment that you have to meet at secretly because he's worried about getting arrested. Zara apparently cares so much about decriminalized prostitution, somehow leading to an increase in all human trafficking, even though that doesn't make any fucking sense, but is apparently unaware of the data showing that after the Nordic model for sex work was adopted in various countries, violence against sex workers, specifically in those areas, increased. The Nordic or end-demand model does not work, and if you actually care about the safety of sex workers, you would listen to them when they say that criminalizing their clients makes their jobs harder. Zara says, how are you going to punish someone by law when they're most likely just trying to make a living? Yet she somehow misses the fact that making it harder for the people she's talking about to make a living through sex work is in itself a punishment. If someone's options are sex work or starve, making it almost impossible or more dangerous for them to make the decision that doesn't lead to starvation just isn't the humanitarian option that you're portraying it as. The big argument that all anti-sex work feminists will hit you with is that most women who do sex work are only doing it for money. Like Lena Dunham, who said in 2015 after signing that fucking letter against Amnesty International. While there are clearly sex workers by choice, the majority globally are there because of poverty, homelessness, etc., aka lack of choice. This is the argument that Zara makes too, and it does kind of make sense coming from those two women specifically, since neither of them has ever had to have a job that they didn't like in their lives. Zara's career started when she won some Swedish talent show at the age of 10. She's never not been in the industry she wanted to work in, and Lena Dunham is infamously a Nepo baby whose entire public persona is just dripping with privilege. Maybe it's genuinely shocking to these women, but most people only have the jobs they have because they need them to make money. How many people, sex workers or not, if they lost their jobs tomorrow, would suddenly be at risk of homelessness? A lot of people. I don't think that every sex worker loves their job, regardless of the money it provides them, but I also don't think that about any group of laborers in any industry, because that's not how jobs work. The problem isn't sex. The problem is capitalism. There's always gonna be jobs that some people will never be willing to do based on their own personal boundaries, and there's always gonna be somebody else willing to do them. You might think that sex work is too degrading or upsetting or whatever, but that's not the relationship that everyone has to it. There's a whole spectrum of reasons for why people do sex work. Some people do genuinely enjoy it and find fulfillment out of the job itself. Some people don't like the job that much, but they like the flexibility it offers, or it pays better than other jobs they've had, or they've just had trouble finding employment in a different line of work. It's kind of like any other profession in that way. Everyone's relationship to it is unique and complicated and not really for other people to judge unless what they're doing is actively hurting other people. Now, none of this is to say that the sex industry is a good or even neutral space for women or anyone else to exist within. Sex workers are at a greater risk of experiencing violence in their work than most other laborers, and I do think that men like Hassan Piker can be somewhat dismissive when the dangers of the industry are brought to their attention. I mean, every time I've seen Hassan talk about the raid on Artemis, he gets pretty defensive and makes it seem like tax evasion was the only reason the club got raided, while completely ignoring the fact that there was a woman trafficked in that club. She wasn't being trafficked by the establishment itself, and I also haven't seen any evidence that she was working at Artemis at the time that Hassan went there, so I definitely think it's ridiculous to try to hold Hassan responsible for that. But that woman's abuse did happen, and it's understandable that people would feel a little put off by his unwillingness to address that. I also can't say I've always loved the ways Hassan downplays the dangers involved in heavy pornography consumption. I think he has a kind of hand-waving approach when these topics come up, and this yet again relates back to my core issues with him and how he alienates female viewers from his audience. And to be honest, I am very sick of talking about Hassan. Every time I say his name, I am of course talking about Hassan Piker the person, but I'm also talking about him as a personification of a larger problem in the political discourse sphere, a representation of the entire brocialist movement that is increasingly getting treated as a representation for the left in its entirety. As someone who is on the left, who is further left than Hassan in many ways, his ineptitude is just a growing point of concern for me. It is plainly obvious that the sex industry hurts people and can be a very dangerous place to both work in and to be a consumer of. Unfortunately, the communities that are the most eager to address those issues do so with a clear anti-sex bias, pushing the idea that any purchasing of sex work is inherently abusive when that's just not true. By dismissing so many people's concerns, I think there are a lot of reasonable people being ushered toward the rhetoric of feminists like Andrea Dworkin, whose anti-porn advocacy just happens to align with the anti-sex sentiments of the far right. And I think there are a lot of criticisms that can be made about how men like Hassan kind of enable that pipeline into alt-right politics to become so enticing to so many people. I'm not saying you shouldn't criticize Hassan for some of the things he says about sex work, but the idea that him going to a brothel one time over a decade ago should invalidate everything he has to say about women is so stupid, especially when there are so many other reasons to call Hassan a misogynist. And to be honest, I don't even think Hassan is that much of a misogynist, on a relative scale. Have you checked in on men recently? They're getting really bad. But it gets a little difficult to call Hassan out for his misogyny when he's convinced that every woman who criticizes him is a swerf, and a whole bunch of people online seem intent on proving him right. This was a very loose and probably not very good video, but I have a lot to say about the topic, and I always have, which is why it was so weird to see so many swerfs assuming that I would agree with them on this. I've never been anti-sex work in my life, and to be honest, I've actually kind of been waiting for an opportunity to call Zara Larsson out on those Instagram stories because I saw them when she posted them, and I've just kind of sat on that for a while, so I'm glad I had this opportunity to talk about that, but I am working on a longer form video essay that I would really, really like to get finished at some point. I've been working on it for a year now, and I'm on a little bit of a time crunch for reasons. So I'm not gonna keep talking about this too much, but I did just feel like I really needed to address this conversation because I've recently seen a lot more people falling down a swerve pipeline, and I just think that's a really disturbing direction for a lot of young feminists to be moving in. Anti-sex work rhetoric is a fundamentally conservative value. It is at its core an anti-rights movement aimed at stripping people of their bodily autonomy and preventing them from being able to make a living in the profession they've chosen. There are reasons to be concerned about the abuse happening in the sex industry. But if you care about the lives of marginalized people, taking away their options for survival is not helpful. Sure, a lot of sex workers might only be doing their job to keep food on the table, but the criminalization of any aspect of the sex trade, whether it's the workers getting prosecuted or the clients, has never successfully stopped the trading of sex for money. It's only made the conditions sex workers work in less safe. And regardless, even if you could stop every financially desperate person from selling sex to feed themselves, unless you're just as dedicated to putting food on their table yourself, you haven't actually done anything to help them. You've just allowed them to starve, but have convinced yourself that that's the most pure and noble thing to do because it didn't have to involve any of that nasty, nasty sex. If you would like to learn more, I'll put some resources in the description, but please just support sex workers. Not just like the idea of them as victims, but as fellow human beings who are trying to make a living just like anybody else. And stream Mayhem, please.